Hello and welcome back to Radio Free Urbanism, a podcast about urbanism and stuff. My name is Nick Laporte, and today is going to be a bit different. I'm not even on the show. Today it's a conversation between Sully and Peter Norton. He is a historian and author who specializes in transportation history, urban planning, and the social impacts of car culture, and he is best known for his book, Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. So enjoy this conversation between Sully and Peter Norton.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
My name's Peter Norton. I'm a historian. I work at the University of Virginia in the Department of Engineering and Society there. I'm really interested in streets, why American streets are so hostile to everybody except drivers, how we got that way, and how we can get to a better future.
Wow. So do you do research in that field and write books or publish papers?
Yeah, I have two books. The first is called Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City. And then the second, and that book's all about the past. The second book is really about the future. It's called Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. And the title Autonorama is a play on words. It comes from mixing Futurama, which was a word that General Motors invented in the 1930s to present a car-dependent future as a utopian wonderland. And I added autonomous to make Autonorama because right now the version of Futurama that we're being sold is a version that says autonomous vehicles will finally make all of these promises come true. Because so far all the promises have never come true, and you can see the failure all around us every day.
So, okay, I don't want to get us too off track, but because you mentioned autonomous vehicles, I want to ask you a specific question because I've seen
Sure.
a sort of split in the, people who consider themselves urbanist or anti-car, especially in the advocacy world, which I deal a lot with. So there seems to be people who have come out against self-driving vehicles for various reasons, and people who say, no, no, these could actually, totally help alleviate traffic, get rid of private vehicle ownership, and if they're all electric, it's sustainable and all this stuff. So if you had to summarize why autonomous vehicles are not a cure-all, and that more traditional methods of transit is like trains, what would that argument look like?
In a sentence, amazing technology does not make car dependency work. So the technology is amazing, and that's why people tend to think, hey, maybe this really will be the game changer we're looking for. But there's two things that prevent amazing technology from making car dependency work. One of them is geometry. Cars take up space. They take up a lot more space than just the footprint of the car because once they're moving, they need a lot of space in front and behind so that they have room to stop. So geometry is one reason why amazing technology does not make car dependency work. You have to sprawl to fit all the cars in. And then the second reason is physics, because each car still weighs a lot. In fact, if they're electric, they weigh even more. And that means they must use a lot of energy per person. And that means because they use a lot of energy per person, even if we electrify them, that means you will have to have a lot of new electric power demand. And we are struggling right now to make our electric power grids more renewable. They're still about three quarters not renewable. And to improve that fraction means needing less electricity, not more. So while we've got data centers growing thanks to AI and lots of other new demands on electric power, we need to find ways to move people that are less energy intensive. And we have them and we've had them for a long time.
Right. So, in other words, an articulated bus that could hold 200 people has one engine versus all those 200 people each using their own engine.
That's right. And it's actually possible for that articulated bus to be electric and to draw its electric power from overhead wires. That's a trolley bus.
Right.
And then you don't even need a battery. So what we forget about electric cars is, well, we don't really forget it, but it needs more attention. These things have batteries that are often 500 kilograms, and they need a lot of scarce metals that come from places where the labor conditions are horrific and where the scarcity of supply is such that we just can't have everybody have their own 1 ton or 500 kilogram battery. So we can electrify transport without needing batteries. And we've known how to do that ever since streetcars, since electric trains, subways. They all use electric power without batteries.
Right. Yeah. And every so often you see these stories, hey, there's this one road in Sweden where they figured out how to charge the vehicles as they drive or something, but it turns out it's going to be millions of dollars per linear foot or whatever it is.
So there's a lot of tech companies that have a lot of stuff to sell us if they can get us to believe that these far-fetched projects will ever be practical. So yes, it is theoretically practical to recharge a car on a specially designed road if the car is going slowly enough and if the road has millions of dollars of tech embedded in it. But the amazing thing is we can move people in an electric streetcar 1900 technology
Right.
uh, without any batteries at all and without the charging problem.
Yeah.
Now,
It almost,
I
yeah.
don't want to pretend that this solves everything. We probably need cars. But the thing is, to have few enough cars and little enough driving to be sustainable, we need to do a lot of other things besides cars. I'm not saying
Right.
get abolish cars. I'm saying make cars a small mix of a much more diverse pool of modes.
Right. Which some cities have achieved. But
Yeah,
it seems like all this talk around the next thing is is sort of a desperate clinging onto the car culture and like if maybe we
yeah.
can tweak it. And I think that's also paired with sort of something that seems paradoxical, which is that a technology that's 120 years old is better than anything we've come up with so far, right? Like electric trains. I mean, there have been improvements like high-speed rail, obviously, but generally speaking, that seems to be, and it's so it seems weird. But there are other things like that, like telephones. I mean, they were invented in the 1800s too. So,
Yeah, we need stuff from the whole spectrum from high tech to zero tech and everything in between.
right.
And as you know, living in Santa Barbara, where there's some traditional Spanish colonial architecture, you have design features that come from long before air conditioning, like arcades, where you have shade and where you're outside, but you're not feeling the heat because you have a nice airflow. And it doesn't take any energy at all to do that. And if you look at traditional vernacular or folk architecture from all over the world, you find design features that make it comfortable in hot weather, or in some climates, they've designed the buildings so that you're comfortable in cold temperature without a lot of heat, or without a lot of energy inputs.
Yeah.
So low tech is we should never think, well, are we pro tech or anti tech? We need the whole thing, but if you only look at the high tech stuff, you're missing some of the best stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no. My architect friend, he comes to our Strong Towns meetings. He would absolutely love. This is his whole thing. He goes even further. He says there's no such thing as architectural style, just buildings adapting to the places that they were invented in. That's like his whole theory. But yeah, no, talk
Well,
about old technology like terracotta roof tiles. I don't think those have changed in a few thousand years, and they do their
that's right.
job. So we
They
don't
do
need a
it
tech
beautifully.
guy coming down from Silicon Valley saying, what if each tile was fitted with a sensor that told you what the moisture was? It's like we don't need that. They work really well or whatever.
Yeah, and there is actually good reason to not overdo high tech because high tech is usually more expensive, harder to maintain, shorter useful life, in part because, you have later generations that make the earlier generations useless. And it very often depends on materials that are hard to come by, like rare earth metals and so on, or even copper. So we have to be careful. And it's not an anti-tech message. It's a message that says, let's choose the tools we need for the job.
Right. So speaking of new inventions, the reason we're talking today is something I don't even know about yet. So you're going to tell me about something that was once a new idea, an ordinance. What is the anniversary of this ordinance, first of all?
On January the 24th,
Mhm.
1925, which is 100 years ago in 2 weeks from the time we're talking here,
Yeah.
Los Angeles introduced a new traffic ordinance, and it's the traffic ordinance that is the ancestor of every local traffic ordinance and state traffic law in the USA today. So it's the ancestor of all of them, the common ancestor. And it was the traffic ordinance that said streets are for cars and people can only cross the street under certain restricted rules at corners, at crosswalks, and so on. And it's the law that really made jaywalking a thing. Now, I have to be clear, there were laws like this before, and there was even anti-jaywalking efforts before this. But it was that law, that traffic ordinance of 1925, that was the one that became the model for the whole country.
Hmm.
And the remarkable thing about it is it didn't come from popular demand. It didn't come from a referendum. It didn't come from consumer demand in a free market. It didn't come because of a democratic process. It came because a Los Angeles car dealer wanted it and hired a man to write it and used his influence to get it implemented. And we don't have to guess why. I mean, it's easy to guess why he wanted to sell cars. But to his credit, this man, his name was Paul Hoffman, said that was his motive. When he retired in the 1950s, he gave a speech, which I have. And in this speech, he told the audience, I was a car dealer, and it was hard to sell cars in a town where everybody's walking everywhere they want because they're getting in the way. And I needed a way to sell more cars, and that traffic ordinance was how I did it.
Okay, wow, yeah, I was going to ask, so who the people were behind this. So it was this car dealer. And then why did people at City Hall listen to him? Well, I mean, did they have a mutual interest that brought them together?
Yes, that's exactly the right question. And Paul Hoffman, the Studebaker dealer, he was the most successful Studebaker dealer in the whole country,
Hmm.
and was in downtown Los Angeles, had a couple of locations. This man, Paul Hoffman, was very influential, and here's why. He was not only interested in promoting driving in Los Angeles, he was also very smart about how to promote this agenda. And one of the things he did to promote this agenda was get together a bunch of businessmen, most of them interested in driving, so that included the taxi cab company. But he wanted to build bridges, so he also got the Los Angeles Railroad involved and some other local interest groups. And he formed a group that he called the Los Angeles Traffic Commission. Now, everybody who hears that name thinks, oh, it's a government body. No, it was a 100% private club of businessmen, invitation only. And he, Paul Hoffman, was the chairman of this thing. Now, these people together, and they included the Automobile Club of Southern California, which was a very big deal with a lot of members already. They could go to City Hall and they could say to City Hall, to City Council, we want X. And City Council had to, take them very seriously because they had that kind of influence. And so this traffic ordinance was actually voted in by City Council. It wasn't like some kind of sneak job. It was, in that sense, democratic. But it was not a citywide referendum. It was also at a time when, even in Los Angeles, most people, at least in central Los Angeles, traveled by the Los Angeles Railway or the Pacific Electric Railway or on foot or on bike. Driving was, Los Angeles was the world capital of driving then, but it was still not the majority way to get around. And they did not trust majority rule on this one. They wanted to get it through without, turning to the whole electorate of Los Angeles County.
So because it wasn't yet a majority mode, and I've wondered this too when we read these stories about streetcars being ripped up across America, where was the pushback? And was there any that I just don't know about? And also, so if there were these business owners interested in having more driving or greater mode share for driving, where were the people who were interested in the rail network, especially considering at the time the rail network was also a private business who
Yes.
you'd imagine they would also have some kind of pull. So what was the political scene at the time? Was there a version of strong townspeople like running around or like what was going on?
The perfect question again. So, um, this was in fact resisted. Most of the resistance was sort of individual law breaking, and the newspapers are full of these cases of people resenting it and resisting it. That's individual level. Incidentally, a lot of that was from women because at this time, although already car ownership was very common in Los Angeles in particular, um, when a family owned a car, the husband nearly always monopolized it. It was the one car per family was the norm if the family had a car at all. And at that time, something like 90% of drivers were men. So a lot of this resistance that you see is from individual women. Now, the railroads were very well organized and very influential, and they had a mixed interest in this. So they actually did not like pedestrians strolling around in the middle of the street wherever they wanted to, because that slowed the streetcars down.
Mhm.
But at the same time, the street railways had a difficult relationship with the automobile people, including the Automobile Club of Southern California, mainly because drivers got in their way a lot, and that would make it impossible for them to keep schedule. And the railways were, in fact, very vocal about this. They said, we can't keep our schedules if you drivers keep driving on the tracks. And if you clog the streets, or if you park along the side of the street and the street become and you don't park close enough to the curb, you can get in the way of the streetcar that way. We can't turn. We're stuck on the rails. So when you guys get in the way, that ruins our schedules. And they were very vocal about that. And they wanted drivers regulated and restricted. And they said, look, we are the street railways and we are regulated very strictly. We have to we can only charge the fare that you permit us to charge. We have to provide our schedules for your approval. We have to serve non-profitable neighborhoods as well as profitable ones. Those are all regulations that we have to deal with. In snowy places, not Los Angeles, we have to clear the snow off the tracks. We have to maintain the pavement between the tracks. Well, we can live with those regulations, but we want drivers to have to be regulated too, so like they will not get in our way and so on. And actually, the Los Angeles Traffic Ordinance of 1925, which got the support of the local railways, for that reason, it said drivers can't block a streetcar. In practice, though, that proved very hard to enforce. And so you find street railways resisting throughout America and demanding regulations and demanding that the tracks be kept clear. But also, street railways were increasingly operating buses, and
Mhm.
they wanted those buses to have priority on streets as well, including priority over pedestrians. So the street railways were kind of, they had a complicated agenda that made them conditional allies sometimes of the auto dealers and the taxi companies and the auto clubs, but certainly not close allies.
No, that's really fascinating because I've always wondered what they had to say, and there doesn't seem to be much on that out there because obviously the winning side was the automobile industry, and so you don't hear much about
Yeah,
what the streetcar people
well,
were up to.
I did look into this very closely for my first book, Fighting Traffic, and there's a whole chapter in there about how the street railways made the following argument, and it didn't win in the end. They argued that uh, a street is a public utility, and that means private users can't expect to use it without complying with regulations, as we, the street railways, do. But the public utility model was undermined by a sort of consumer demand model in the following way. It was also in the 1920s that automobile interest groups got behind the idea that drivers would pay for the roads through gasoline taxes and therefore be entitled to use them as priority users. So in 1920, only Oregon had a gasoline tax. They got theirs in 1919. By 1930, all 48 states and the District of Columbia had a gasoline tax. And the reason is the automobile people, automobile clubs, dealers, manufacturers, taxi cab companies, and so on, they got behind gasoline taxes. They said to states, we will support a gasoline tax on the following condition, and that condition is that the money goes to roads and streets. And that condition let them claim, well, that means roads and streets are for us. That the streetways did not agree with that part, but the automobile interest groups did prevail on that one.
And I guess it's worth mentioning, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you say the automobile clubs and you're talking about 1919, 1920, presumably it's only really some of the most wealthy individuals in society that would have a car at that point. I mean, the Model T had just come out, but so we
Yeah,
are talking about the transit riders versus these car owner clubs. It makes sense that the car owners would have more money behind them,
yeah, they have
generally
good
wealthier.
data even from this era that show that even in 1925, most people in Los Angeles were getting around with streetcars, not automobiles.
Yeah,
But because Los Angeles did have the highest rate of driving of any city in the whole world, that did make it the easiest place to start for people like Paul Hoffman who wanted cars to come first.
right.
Because cars were last until this moment. The judges, the tradition, in the common law tradition, judges rule on the basis of precedent. And so that's how streets were governed before traffic ordinances. Before traffic ordinances, judges used common law precedents, and they said, under common law, the pedestrian has an absolute right to the street. They are not second to anybody, and they may use the street wherever they choose.
Hmm.
And that was what Hoffman wanted to overturn.
As far as the law was concerned, streets were seen as pedestrian first, uh, I guess a public good, a public utility, similar to
Yes,
like a green, like a some kind of shared space.
exactly. A common. Yeah, it was a
Um,
commons.
yeah.
And that meant anybody could use it for anything under basically two conditions. One is that you didn't make a nuisance of yourself to others, like by obstructing them, and the other is that you didn't endanger others.
Mhm.
And under that standard, the automobile was the most suspect street user because it did both. It took up a lot of space and therefore was likely to get in others' way. And because it could drive pretty fast and wasn't confined to tracks, it could also endanger others. And that's why the common law standard, which we inherited from Great Britain here, was a threat. And into the early 1920s, the judges were consistently siding with the pedestrian, even when the pedestrian was doing what we would now call jaywalking. The judge would say, well, look, it doesn't matter. The duty of care is on the operator of the dangerous machine,
Hmm.
not on the person who can't hurt other people. That was the common law standard, duty of care. Negligence was another common law standard that said you are not negligent if you can't actually harm anybody else. You are negligent if your motor vehicle can harm someone else. You as a pedestrian could be found guilty of contributory negligence, but that was a very hard standard to meet. And so basically, if you were a driver in 1920, you were hyper alert because if you know, first of all, you probably cared about people, but even if you didn't care about people, if you injured a pedestrian, even if they ran out into the middle of the street, in the middle of the block, away from the crosswalk, that was on you. And that's what people like Paul Hoffman wanted to change.
Wow. So it sounds like roads were basically like this chaotic place. There were no lines painted yet. I guess a lot of roads were still unpaved, actually. And so it was
Yes,
almost more like like the central walkway in a fairground than it was that the idea that you have to move people quickly through it.
Sully, that is such a good metaphor. So sometimes people will say, oh, it sounds like it must have been chaos. It sounds like it must have been just terribly inefficient. But actually, human beings are remarkably good at navigating spaces through their own intuitions better than any engineering diagram could ever do. Like if you take a fairground where a lot of people are rushing from ride to ride or whatever like that, or walking from ride to ride, they naturally form channels where you
Mhm.
stay behind other people who are walking and you form a little river, and there are other little rivers going the other way. And researchers have studied this and they found that people are incredibly efficient. You take a really busy airport corridor, you got people about to miss their flights running. You got those little cars that are moving, let's say, people who have trouble walking. There's electric cars and they got their luggage and they're moving through. And you got people strolling along, sometimes two or three abreast. And it works with efficiency you could never duplicate if you tried to impose an engineering control on it. It works
Right.
beautifully. And so streets actually did work very well because of people's skill at navigating space.
And I think we miss, I haven't seen this take anywhere, but I think we miss that chaos a little bit because I don't think it's a coincidence that in every Disney movie, and also like in Star Wars, which of course is now a Disney movie, every planet they go to is, this complicated market with people selling stuff and they're walking around and there's like hovercraft and people leading animals around. It's like you never would actually see that in your day-to-day life. It's only in Star somehow this super advanced spacefaring civilization has like old school traditional urbanist planets that they go to.
Yeah.
And we miss it.
And yeah, Sully, I think that's exactly right. People do miss the kind of um, humane, intimate, human scale, intuitive environment. And I think some of what we see in movies like that is recognizing that we miss those places and would like to experience them in the film.
Yeah.
And of course, a lot of Americans, when they take a trip somewhere, they go to Mexico or Europe where they can find streets like that again because they love them.
Right. Yeah. I think, yeah, not only do we miss it, we recognize, imagine if in these movies they went somewhere and it looked like suburbia. What would they it would be very boring.
Well, we
Um,
would probably call that a dystopian film, and there are such dystopian films too,
right.
set in suburban expanses that are sort of anonymous. A good example is not coming to mind, but I'm sure you're acquainted with good examples of suburban wasteland movies where
Yeah.
everything's the same.
There's The Wrinkle in Time, which was a great book, which was recently made into a movie. And one of the creepiest scenes is when they go to that suburb and there's all the houses that look the same and all the kids that
Okay,
look the same. Yeah. And it's supposed to be like very dystopian. Um, But okay, I have another question for you about the streetcar companies who, like we were talking about, let's say in 1920, were still very strong and private businesses that were interested in making a profit. So at that sort of moment, this tipping point where you had this tension between the pedestrians and the streetcars and the motorists, was there talk of grade separation? Was there because one of the solutions to the problem that you described earlier, where the streetcars were saying there's people walking in front of our things and there's cars blocking it. So then what was one of the in any city, I mean in LA included, did they
absolutely.
because there had been grade separation in other cities earlier, like in Chicago. So yeah, was
Yep.
that part of the conversation?
Absolutely, it was. And of course, grade separation with rail it goes back to the 19th century. Now, if you go back to the mid 19th century, it was very hard because steam railroads and tunnels don't mix very well.
Right.
And in particular, you can't really have a subway with steam trains because the subway station would be uninhabitable with, the clouds of steam filling it. It would just fill up the whole space. And the steam railroad train also needs a free draw of air, and it's just hard to get that in. But as electrification came in, suddenly underground grade separation became much more feasible. And of course, overhead viaducts with steam railroads were common in big cities like London and New York. Elevated railroads were introduced in the mid 19th century. But electrification made grade separation for rail much easier. And yes, there were, of course, subways in the US, Boston being the first, then New York,
Right.
elevated railroads as well, especially in New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. And yes, Los Angeles got a serious start on its own subway system. And in fact, the LA Metro today recovered some of the tunnels that were built for the Los Angeles subway that was never uh, in operation before, but the tunnels were there. Other U.S. cities actually built tunnels and then never pursued them. Cincinnati, which has never had a subway, has subway tunnels
That's
because
right.
they,
Yeah.
yeah, as you know, so they started this as well. Now, in Los Angeles, there was not a lot of effort toward grade separation. There were a couple of interesting examples. You may have heard of the Pasadena Cycleway, which
Hmm.
was a grade separated cycleway from Pasadena. Um, it was temporary, it was private, and it kind of died when the fashion for cycling declined in the early 20th century. But also in the 20s, there was a serious effort led by the Automobile Club of Southern California to have pedestrian subways, which are really just cross the street tunnels.
Hmm.
Los Angeles has lots of them. Most of them are closed. Most of them are sealed off, uh, because they're viewed as dangerous places where you don't know who you're going to meet in them, or places that, will smell like urine and so on before long because we don't have enough public restrooms. And those were primarily intended by the Automobile Club of Southern California to fight back against the message that drivers were particularly endangering school children. If you look at the traffic deaths of 100 years ago, the demographics were really different. So today, the overwhelming majority, about something on the order of 80% of traffic deaths are people inside a car and the car crashes and they're killed. But if you go back to, let's say, Los Angeles in 1920, probably three-quarters of the people getting killed were pedestrians,
Hmm.
and about half of them were kids. And this made, of course, terrible press. And there were serious proposals in other cities to require cars to be equipped with a speed governor that would make it impossible to speed. And the usual reason is to protect children's right to the street. Now, in Los Angeles, they were afraid of that. And so what they said is, well, you won't need that here because we're going to make pedestrian tunnels and the children can use those. It never really was much of a success. They did open a bunch of them and children did use them for a while, but they got to be regarded as dangerous and inconvenient places for people to walk.
Yeah, and there was a great video that was made about those. So I guess you could say there was grade separation. It was just between cars and pedestrians, not with trains. And there is still an open one of these. I actually know exactly where it's on Olympic, a little bit
Mm,
north of Overland. And I've used that one, and it's one of the few open ones. And it might still be open because it's in a relatively nice neighborhood
uh-huh.
and not near a commercial area. But yeah, Olympic Boulevard is sort of the epitome of a street that isn't a freeway and yet in every way tries to be a freeway. It's, at least 6 lanes, three in each
Mm,
direction with
hmm
no parking
hmm
and very high speeds and lights as infrequently as possible. And yet it
Yeah,
goes through the middle of a bunch of houses and it's not grade separated. It's very weird. And I guess what we're talking about in this moment in the 20s is when that conception of a street actually came about, that streets could be like that, that they could
right,
be, let's get as many cars through as possible. It's not even a place anymore.
right.
Um, and by the way, that tunnel, I don't know if it's that one particularly, but some of these pedestrian tunnels have been actually great props for movies when they want to pretend that someone's been coming out of a subway, which I saw there's a
Ah,
1978 movie called Tunnel Vision. And it was made in 78, but it takes place in the future. It takes place in the late 80s
okay.
in LA, right? So like 15 years into the future or something, or 10 years into the future. Anyway, there's a fake news segment on the TV about the Los Angeles subway opening, and they use one of those pedestrian tunnels, the entrance, as a
Uh-huh.
pretend, which was a great prop, but it
Clever.
was there.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're like one of almost no audience members who who figured out what they were doing there.
Yes. Yeah, no, I knew exactly what was going on. I also have the benefit that my dad helped make that movie, which is why I know it. It's pretty obscure,
Ah,
pretty obscure film. But yeah, my dad is in the industry, as they say. But anyway, so w did this ordinance, were there lines painted yet on streets? Or was
This
this
is
part of
when
that?
this is when the line painting was serious. Now, some cities were painting crosswalk lines as early as about 1915. Detroit had them unsurprisingly in 1915, and then other cities started to imitate them. But one of the effects of the ordinance was they realized you can't really enforce this or demand enforcement unless people know exactly where to cross. And so there was a serious effort because of the people who wanted to get this ordinance through, people like Paul Hoffman and his friends on the Los Angeles Traffic Commission. They made sure the crosswalks were painted thereafter. So if you'd walked around Los Angeles in 1924, you would not have seen painted crosswalks. There were probably a few downtown, but that was about it. But if you walked around Los Angeles in, let's say, 1925, 26, they were everywhere. That's really the watershed moment when
Mhm.
painted crosswalks uh, proliferated.
There were still, on most streets, there were still sidewalks with curbs and then sort of a street bed, though, right? So, like, there was still some separation between the middle of the street and the
Oh
edges.
yeah.
So, what
So
was the culture around that? Like, how
the
would somebody use the
separation,
street?
right, the separation between the sidewalk and the street bed, which was usually called the roadway. So the roadway is the street without the sidewalks. That separation had been distinct for centuries.
Mhm.
And the main reason why was you wanted sidewalks to be higher because the drainage wasn't always very good on the roadway. And of course, with horse traffic, you would have manure, horse urine, and so on on the roadway. And so sidewalks were deliberately higher than the rest of the street. And in fact, crosswalks are much older than the automobile. They were usually just called crossings, not crosswalks, before the automobile era. And the crossings were usually where the crosswalks are today, and they were just paving stones set higher in the roadbed
Right.
so that you could step on them and stay out of the muck and the mire in the street itself. But meanwhile, the wheeled vehicles could still pass over them because they were separated stones. So people were, in fact, used to staying on the sidewalk and used to crossing at the corners long before this traffic ordinance. But the traffic ordinance was the moment when this became a law, such that the crosswalk was no longer a bonus the way it had been before, a sort of nicer way to cross, but mandatory.
Right. And I know exactly what you're talking about because I've seen it in Pompeii, where
Ah, yeah.
they where it was
Now in
preserved in time.
Pompeii, the elevation is huge. The
Yeah.
difference uh, in a typical American street of say 1900, the difference was a couple of inches in height between the paving
Right.
stone and the street.
And of course, I mean, we're talking about in downtown zones, maybe be the places where you'd really only cross the corners, but on most residential streets, I imagine you could just like kind of wander around, and there would be far less horse manure there anyway.
People strolled absolutely freely anywhere in the street. The reason why they concentrated at the crossings, especially downtown, was really because of two things. One is the crossing stones, which were especially for ladies with their long skirts and the social norms of that time. That was the nicer place to cross. But also, of course, because if you're walking, let's say, 3 blocks on a street, you cross at the corners because that's the geometry of the rational trip. So
Right.
those were it was not because of laws requiring you to. There's a lot of court cases behind this too. There are court cases in the 19th century where, let's say, wagon drivers tried to argue that somebody crossing in the middle of the street was therefore guilty of contributory negligence. Judges nearly always threw that out. There's even a California Supreme Court case from 1871
Hmm.
where the judges ruled unanimously that an unattended child is entitled to the full use of the street, and it's everyone else's job to look out for that child.
Wow. And that's still legal precedent now. I mean, if it was an American court case, like technically, but it's been so buried probably.
Well, the thing is, the common law principle or precedent stands until statutory law is passed that
Ah,
supersedes it. And
okay.
so the statutory law superseded that one. In that case, a 7-year-old child playing in the street in San Francisco was killed by a horse-drawn streetcar. And the streetcar company, which is a private company, said, well, this was a 7-year-old child running in the street. What, we can't do anything about that. And the California Supreme Court said, it's your job to
Mhm.
watch out for little kids.
That's
And
incredible.
they were liable for that child's death.
That's absolutely incredible. What would ha yeah, I'm trying to think if there was a similar case today where a kid ran out into the middle of a busy road in LA, that would not be what the finding would be.
No, no.
Yeah.
So the court would almost certainly rule, or the judge would almost certainly rule that the child's death was an unavoidable accident because there was no way for the driver to stop, and the driver did not have to because of the fact that the child was not in a crosswalk.
Yeah, and speaking of San Francisco, a great example, of course, if you want to see how people moved around the street is that pre-earthquake footage
Yeah, yeah,
of
that's
Market Street.
amazing footage. That
Right.
was really precious footage. And yeah, you do see the kids running around. Now, historians, I can't give you names off the top of my head, but have examined that film and decide that you're not seeing a totally spontaneous scene there. Some of that is sort of done to make the view more interesting. So
Yeah. Okay.
a good indication of that is that you will see the same motor car, passing the streetcar about 4 or 5 times.
Okay.
And clearly the filmmaker decided it was more interesting if this car did this. And that means some of the kids running in front of the car may have been coached to do it. We just don't know.
Hmm.
But the fact is that that film footage is still faithfully giving us a look at the fact that streets were an open place for everybody at that time.
And they're trying to do, I mean, they have tried to make Market Street back into that, right? It's car free
Yep.
now and it's supposed to be a transit mall. But explaining this idea of a transit mall to Americans in Santa Barbara, we're trying to do the same thing on State Street, right? Where, people are saying either it's pedestrianized or it has cars and buses. Because how on earth can you expect even electric shuttles to go down the street if there's people walking around? It's like, no, everything works really well
Yep.
except for cars. And I know this. What's so funny is this 1906 footage seems so antique and alien to us now. But I've actually been somewhere that was shockingly reminiscent, which I talked about in a presentation I gave, which is Jaffa Street in Jerusalem.
Mm,
It's like almost 4 miles long. And
yeah.
it's everything but cars. And in fact, it has a light
Hmm.
rail system that goes down the middle of it. And it moves relatively
Yeah.
fast. Like it's maybe 15, 20 miles an hour. But I got this footage I was so
Hmm.
excited about of people walking around as the train is coming. And then they just kind of move out of the way. The train
Hmm.
comes by. And then immediately after the
Yep.
train leaves the frame, people fill up the space right. And I was like, this is no different from that 1906 footage. It's that we're still human, we're
Yep.
still the same. And it's like, I'll send that to you because I loved that little,
That's
it was not
fantastic,
staged.
Sully. And
Yeah.
it's also a reminder of the fact that if you really want efficient use of space, let people do what they want because people can pass each other by inches without ever colliding. But if you want to try to impose that, you have to do it by putting in signals and so on that make people wait for nothing and that separate people by more space than they need. Now,
Right.
of course, the decisive difference is speed. You cannot mix speed with people walking, and that's where the problems really kick in.
Right. Yeah. Which is why I think it's so funny when people complain that cyclists, I saw a bike not stop at a stop sign. Okay. Granted, maybe they should have, but also I like to remind people that stop signs were invented for cars. In a world without cars, the
Exactly.
bikes don't have to stop at stop signs because there's no danger of them killing anyone. And yes, that goes for electric bikes too. I know people are freaked out about e-bikes, but even
Yeah,
going 20 miles an hour, an e-bike can't kill someone. Uh,
that's right.
but yeah,
You're
e-bikes
exactly
are a
right.
whole can of worms. Um, but yeah, I was wondering if you ever saw, because I actually looked up, speaking about this LA stuff again, the Olmsted plan, which for many Angelinos lives rent free in their heads because they've heard about it through the grapevine. Oh, we almost had this park system or something. What's interesting about the original text of it is that it has almost no pictures or drawings at all, and it's just a bunch of like text. And yes, there was a proposal to do this park along the LA River. But I was super surprised. One of the few diagrams in the whole thing is not of the park. It's a traffic counts in
Mm,
LA.
hmm.
And I was like, I thought some of the oldest traffic counts I've ever seen. And they basically changed the thickness of the roads based on how many
Yes,
cars.
these black lines. Yeah.
Yes, that was like the
Hmm.
style. The traffic counts really go
Right.
only out to like Fairfax because that's really as far out as people were going at the time. And it's from, I think, 1924. I
That's
don't,
right. Hmm.
okay. And yeah, and it was so interesting because a lot of it just deals with these traffic counts and how to, and there were these dotted lines showing new 100-foot boulevards, which
Mm,
also seemed to be a bit of an innovation because I think that one of the biggest issues that LA will have, whether or not it wants to change itself, is that the roads are so ridiculously wide. These 120-foot plus wide streets,
hmm.
even if you do put room for other stuff, people will always see it as like it'll never feel walkable because of how wide they are.
Right.
Um, do you know about when that was happening? Like when did roads go from being like downtown LA size, like 60 to 80 feet, to suddenly 100 to 150?
Well, this varies city by city. Certainly in Los Angeles, I think you've got the era about right. Wilshire Boulevard in particular is a sort of watershed, the Miracle Mile,
Right.
in part because the idea then was to make parking integral to the whole street design. So they had parking planned into that one from the beginning, and that was a first. But this varies a lot city by city. So there's plenty of cities where very wide boulevards were part of the plan. Washington, D.C. is a good case in point. The L'Enfant plan goes back about 200 years, and it
Right.
was already planning these grand boulevards. And a very influential plan uh, in Europe and North America as well was Paris's Haussmann plan from the 1860s when Paris put in those big boulevards. Those are very wide. The big Paris boulevards are very wide, and and U.S. cities imitated them. In particular, Detroit and Chicago imitated them. But often the downtowns, if they were older, like for example in Philadelphia and Boston, would still have a lot of narrow streets in them.
And of course, what's crazy to think is when those streets were designed in Paris or even earlier in DC, obviously there was no conception that they would one day be filled with automobiles. So it's weird
That's
to
right.
think they were designing them for like to be filled with people and
Well,
slow-moving carriages, an army
there
in that
was
part also.
part of this was to have a certain grandeur or effective awe on the person.
Right.
Part of it was because of the vista. So, of course, the Arch of Triumph in Paris is at the end of the Champs-Élysées, and you get a wonderful visual that way. And you get that in Washington as well, where you have the big boulevards that culminate in squares like DuPont Circle and Lafayette Park and so on.
Right.
So if you're acquainted with the French garden design as opposed to the English garden design, I don't know if that vocabulary
Yes, no, I
registers.
do. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, the French garden design. So this goes back way before the automobile. Like if you look at a plan view or satellite view of Versailles, you see these big grand boulevards, but they're just for walking. And the idea is that it gives the viewer a sense of grandeur. And certainly the City Beautiful movement in the US
Right.
was attached to this. So if you look at the plan in Chicago, the Daniel Burnham plan of 1909 in Chicago, big boulevards and mostly for that effective grandeur rather than for moving lots of cars.
Right. It just so happens that they were good at moving cars later on. Um,
That's right. Yeah.
which is
Uh, although
yeah.
although there was a bit of a controversy about that because when you have a grand boulevard with lots of cross streets, you can have a lot of backups as people are stopped to make turns, especially left turns, but also right turns. People
Right.
coming onto the boulevard, people leaving the boulevard. Those things cause a lot of jams. And so the boulevard idea got some disapproval by the 1920s by people who were saying we need to have limited access boulevards, i.e., freeways,
Right.
and or what I mean, the guy who actually wrote the traffic ordinance of 1925 in Los Angeles was one of the pioneers of this too. He called them limited ways.
Hmm.
That term is long gone, but that was his term because he meant limited access boulevards.
Right.
And as I'm sure you know, Los Angeles was a pioneer at that as well. So the
Mhm.
Arroyo Seco freeway opened in, I think, 39, give or take a year.
Yeah, first freeway in
Although
America.
Yeah, although if you look at it, it looks crazy now because there's no um, places to build up speed. You're just dumped right into the traffic on it.
Yeah, yeah, no, but yeah, LA seemed to be first in a lot of the first major city to tear out their entire transit system, first to build a freeway. But yeah, and in the Olmsted plan, they're called parkways, which makes them sound so lovely. And
Yeah.
he had almost arrived at the freeway idea. I think there were still major cross streets with other parkways, but they weren't quite freeways yet with on-ramps and
Well, there
off-ramps.
was a kind of a parkway movement, and the parkway proponents were not the same as the freeway proponents. The parkway
Right.
proponents were actually, as you probably know, interested in people slowing down and putting in some gentle curves that would slow you down and give you the view. It was not supposed to be a maximum vehicular throughput machine like the
Mhm.
freeway.
So what I want to talk about now is after that ordinance got passed, you said it was a model for other cities.
Yes.
So what did that process look like, and how quickly until basically everyone had adopted something similar?
So locally in Los Angeles, there was this Los Angeles Traffic Commission, Paul G. Hoffman, trying to get motorist priority over pedestrians, getting this ordinance written and approved. And so with all this stuff, they had that in place by 1925. Now, the next step was to take this national, and there was already an effort among automobile manufacturers, auto clubs, car dealers, and other interest groups like that. And incidentally, these interest groups had a name for themselves that I find very useful. They called themselves Motordom.
Mhm.
And so I've revived this word in my work because it's so much easier than running through the whole list of interest groups. So Motordom got behind this Los Angeles traffic ordinance, and they saw an opportunity that coincided with this Los Angeles effort. So the draft of the 1925 ordinance was published October the 1st, 1924. And at that time, the Commerce Department, the U.S. Commerce Department, under Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover, who was Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce,
Mhm.
was inviting people to Washington that December. So we're talking December 1924, or 100 years plus 1 month ago. And at that conference, Herbert Hoover wanted to find a way to reduce the death toll from traffic, which was rising steeply at the time. And some of the interest groups that were invited to that meeting in Washington in December 1925 got together and said, "Hey, did you see what they're doing in Los Angeles? We need to take that national."
Mhm.
Now, this was interesting because we know that Herbert Hoover at first thought that this conference was going to be an occasion to restrict driving, to slow drivers down, to protect pedestrians and streets. We know that because he wrote a draft of his speech to the conference, and the draft said, pedestrians' rights have to be respected. And he sent it out to his staff for comment, and his staff said, and I know because I've looked in the records, his staff said, "Chief," they called him Chief. "Chief, you can't say that because if you say that, the automobile people will walk out of your conference and your conference will be a failure." So he rewrote it, uh, and dropped everything that offended Motordom from his speech.
Hmm.
Motordom met in Washington in 1924, and there was a committee, and the committee was charged with drafting what they called a model municipal traffic ordinance. And by that they meant a traffic ordinance that any city could adopt. It would be off the shelf, and it would have the imprimatur of the U.S. Department of Commerce on it, so you knew you were dealing with the bona fide expert thing. Now, on that committee, at first Herbert Hoover wanted to put a bunch of lawyers and other people like that, and his staff said, "No, Chief." And this is all internal correspondence that you can find at the Herbert Hoover Library in Iowa. They said, "No, Chief, you should put automobile people in charge of this." And here's why. If automobile people are in charge of it and they like the model ordinance, they are very powerful and influential, and they will get that thing implemented throughout the whole country. So Herbert Hoover agreed. They put a Cadillac dealer in charge of the committee, a guy named William Metzger, and they wrote a model municipal traffic ordinance for the whole country. But the thing is, they did not have to come up with it from scratch because these guys agreed, hey, LA did it the right way. Let's do what they did. Let's take it national. That was the US level. This also had a California level stage prior to that where the Automobile Club of Southern California, plus the California State Automobile Association, which covered Northern California, they got together and they said, let's take this Los Angeles ordinance and let's promote it to every municipality in the state of California. So I didn't help you with my sequencing there because the California part came first,
That's fine.
but but you can see that Los Angeles ordinance became a model for the state of California
Hmm.
and then for the whole country. And uh, sometimes whole states would implement it for every city in their state in one go. More often, the cities themselves implemented them, but they were copying each other and copying the model ordinance. And why that ordinance? Well, it's because when it came time to sell this thing to legislators, sometimes state legislators or sometimes city councils, there was always a lot of well-organized interest groups, could be local motordom or statewide motordom, who would come to your city hall or your state house and say, here's why you need this U.S. Department of Commerce model municipal traffic ordinance. It's the state of the art. It's the modern way to go. Put that in.
This is so fascinating. I love how you're talking about this historical research and reading the staff correspondence of Herbert Hoover's
Yeah,
staff. That's
yeah.
so crazy because I have not heard this story. It very much parallels, even in the time frame, parallels the story of zoning and zoning codes.
Yes, it does.
But this is about
It very
traffic,
much
and I
does.
feel like this story has not been told. And I feel like every urbanist knows sort of the zoning story now. Although a
Right.
detail I actually learned, of course, New York had the first actual code, but it was LA also that had a landmark lawsuit in 1917 about nuisance law, where
Okay, that's a lawsuit I need to learn more about. I know
yeah,
the
there
other
was
classic examples.
yeah, it was fascinating. There was a brick manufacturer who had opened up before the neighborhood was
Oh, yes.
residential.
Yeah,
Yeah, and then
I'm
people are building
acquainted with this.
houses, and they say we don't
Mm,
want to live next to a brick manufacturer. And he said, "Well, I
right.
was here first," and they
Yeah.
sided with the homeowners, which is yeah. So, but anyway, no, I love this ordinance thing, and it similarly seems to be non-data driven, just as zoning was non-data driven. Because as these states were adopting this ordinance or versions of this, was anyone going back and looking at whether fatalities had gone down or traffic had improved? Like, was you know what I mean? Like, was anyone actually keeping
Yeah.
track?
Well, you're right. It was not data driven, but that's not to say there wasn't data strategy at work. In fact, data were essential to this transformation. And I'll explain why. Like, if you looked at the newspapers of 1920, they were very upset about the number of people getting killed, and they were always blaming the driver because remember, streets are for everybody, and it's the driver who's operating the dangerous machinery.
Hmm.
Now, that feeling led to proposals that terrified motordom, and those proposals took a couple of forms. One was to restrict driving, like New York considered restricting private automobiles in lower Manhattan. But the more common one was demands for mandatory mechanical speed governors on all automobiles.
Right.
In Cincinnati, 42,000 people signed petitions for this in 1923. And their reasoning was this is how you protect people walking. Well, that particular proposal really terrified Motordom, and they had meetings about it. I've seen some of their conversations about it. They said, what's going wrong here is people are getting killed and they're blaming the driver and the car, and that's leading to restrictions. We have to shift the blame from the driver and the car to the pedestrian, and that will get us off the hook. But then, of course, they're like, well, how do we do that? And their answer was data. And
Mm.
here's what we'll do. We will offer the newspapers of the country a free wire service. So, of course, the newspapers were mostly running stories that were written for them by news agencies, wire services, so that and they had to pay for most of those wire services. But Motordom, and I specifically mean the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, which was the trade association that represented manufacturers, they said, we'll give newspapers a free news service. We'll send them news stories that they can run verbatim. They'll be professionally copy edited so that they'll look good. And those news stories will have the numbers of people killed and who's at fault. And we'll just blame pedestrians anywhere
Oh.
except if they were anywhere except in a crosswalk. And so all of a sudden, and these newspapers are digitized and searchable, so you can see it happening. Uh, in 1923 and into 24, the newspapers are blaming the driver. By the end of 1924 and into 1925, they're blaming jaywalking.
Mm.
And you can connect this with actual stories that were delivered by teletype machines to the newspapers from Detroit. They say, your problem in Chicago or in Cincinnati or in Sacramento or whatever is because of jaywalkers. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like all of a sudden they were blaming jaywalkers 100%, but they were blaming jaywalkers all of a sudden in a majority of cases in which there was a pedestrian death. And before that, the driver was basically always blamed. And they're saying, well, this is what the data say. But you know that you can always tell a version of the story that gives you the data that you want. So a person strolling crossing the street in the middle of the block, and then a speeder comes by and hits them. Well, you could say, okay, it's this driver's fault because he was speeding, but you could say, no, it's the pedestrian's fault because they were crossing where they wanted. And that degree of ambiguity applies to some degree to almost everybody. These cases are never unambiguous. And so they basically just said, if the person was in the middle of the block, they're getting the blame, the
Mm-hmm.
pedestrian.
Mm-hmm.
And before they had sent out a single story, they said, we are going to show them with data that in a majority of cases, it's the pedestrian's own fault. And so
Wow.
you can watch the press coverage changing. And so it's not data driven, but it's strategic data being deployed to drive an agenda.
That's crazy. So, okay, they shift the conversation in the newspapers. When would you say the last whimper of the pedestrian not being at fault died out in terms of like if you look at letters to the editor and stuff, like was that by the mid 30s, would you say? When did the strategy
That
work?
that never died out. Now, the
Hmm.
strategy was working in the sense that the newspapers themselves were blaming the pedestrian more. The law enforcement was blaming the pedestrian more, and even sometimes the letters to the editor were blaming the pedestrian more, such that by about 1930, you could say that Motordom had prevailed and that anybody crossing the street outside the crosswalk was, irresponsible
Hmm.
to a sort of majority or mainstream perspective by 1930. But the resistance never subsides because you continue to see a steady stream of letters to the editor, to the newspaper, saying, well, here's why crossing in the middle of the block is safer. That's a common letter. because you only have to look two directions instead of four. Or here's why J drivers are the real problem. You see that coming up. Or we pedestrians need a chance, and if you don't give us a chance, then we're entitled to do what we have to do. These kinds of letters continued, and even actual sort of resistance never stops, especially among mothers who wanted to protect their children's safe use of the street. Mothers especially in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, in the height of the automobile era, were illegally blocking streets in Los Angeles County, in Pacoima, and throughout the USA, in cities large and small, and in towns and suburbs too, illegally blocking streets, demanding safer streets for walking. That was
Mhm.
very common. That story's been completely forgotten. I've had to revive it. I have an article about it. These were so common that reporters had a term for these protests. They were called baby carriage blockades
You posted
because
about
the
this on LinkedIn recently, right?
yeah.
I saw
So
that picture. Yeah.
baby carriage blockades were when mothers would block streets with their baby carriages, and that was very smart because the baby carriages were usually empty, but they knew that the drivers don't know the baby carriage is empty, so it's a great way to make the drivers slow down.
Right. Yes. That was an amazing picture. They're at an intersection, like holding hands almost in a line.
Oh
Especially
yeah,
in these
there's a
neighborhoods where
bunch
there's
of
no
those.
parks, you
Yeah.
know.
And those were common in Los Angeles. In fact, Los Angeles was one of the first places to have these blockades.
That's so fascinating. The 1920s, what a crazy time. I mean, this is when
Now,
zoning and
I
yeah.
need to say that those protests were unusual until about 1940. That's when they
Okay.
took off. They kind of there was a transition point. So I don't want to make you think that those things were happening in the 20s.
Right. No, but in general, when you talk about shifting public opinion like this in 5 years and shifting the whole, obviously you have the Euclid v. Amber, shifting the entire definition of what you're allowed to do with your private property, shifting the definition of what streets are for. What a
Right.
fascinating moment in time, this decade.
Yes. Yes,
Incredible
indeed.
change. And so much of it on paper and then translated into the real world when these laws actually took effect. And yeah, we forget things were ever another way. So, I should have asked you this earlier too, but if you had to say, what are the essential, just in a list, the essential components of the ordinance?
So number one was that the automobile has the right of way everywhere in the street, superseding that of the pedestrian with just a few exceptions. And those exceptions are at marked crosswalks and when there's a signal in the pedestrian's favor. Now, even those were restricted in a couple of senses. One is that outside of the downtown district, right turn on red was permitted by this ordinance. So this is really the beginning of right turn on red.
Hmm.
They did not permit that in the downtown district, but everywhere else. So, and of course, if you're a pedestrian, that's a big complication, and that's remains a major problem for pedestrians. Right turn on red did not become state law in California until the late 40s or shortly after World War II. And then now, and then that really spread nationwide, especially after the OPEC oil embargo when Motordom claimed that it saves fuel to permit right turn on red. It's a bogus claim, but it was a useful one.
Hmm.
And now, and now it's spread nationwide. But so there's that. Now pedestrians were protected at crosswalks. Pedestrians were expected to signal their intention to cross by raising their hand. Now that became the butt of a lot of jokes very quickly thereafter. One reason is that pedestrians often are carrying things
Mhm.
if they're shopping, women in particular. A woman with a bag of groceries and a baby carriage is not going to raise her hand to stop anybody. So the raising the hand to stop traffic part was dropped. It's not in the model municipal traffic ordinance, but that was another part of it. Pedestrians' right to cross marked crosswalks safely was included in the law, and also their right to use safety zones, which were like we would call them like traffic islands, although sometimes they were just paint in the middle of the street. And those were very common because to board a streetcar then, you had to stand in the middle of the street because that's where the tracks were.
Hmm.
And so the place for the pedestrians to stand were called safety zones. And at those places, the ordinance also provided that the pedestrian has a right to use those places safely. Of course, the fact is they were really exposed there as well. The ordinance provided for a $5 fine for jaywalking. And, if you adjust for it, you can look at an inflation calculator, but it's probably something like $50 today. And that was enforced as of 2 o'clock a.m. on January the 24th, 1925. We have the first arrests, and the local papers covered those with a lot of interest. Um, Although I have to say, the enforcement part is interesting. The Automobile Club of Southern California was really a major proponent of this law.
Hmm.
Their president was a guy named E.B. Lefferts, and he told the police, and this tells you something about the pull that these interest groups had. They could tell the police what to do. He said to the police, only arrest them if they're really combative. I want you to embarrass people instead. Ridicule, he said, works better. And so
Whoa.
blow your whistle at them and make people look. And so the technique was this: you tell the police officer, you blow your whistle at a jaywalker, point at them, and then watch as all the crowds, because there were crowds then on the sidewalks, people were walking then. The crowds will stare and the person will feel shame. And you want to deploy that. And even,
Yeah.
believe it or not, they said, if it's a woman, pick her up like this and put her back on the sidewalk. And
Whoa.
and this was deliberate humiliation because for a woman to be picked up by a man in public like that was humiliating, and it was intended to humiliate, and this technique was done as well. In
That
fact, I
is
have,
crazy.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah,
And of course, we just finally repealed fines for jaywalking in California, what, 2 years ago now?
yep, hmm.
So it didn't quite last 100 years. Um, but yeah, that's crazy shame tactic. And of course, that wasn't written in the law anywhere, but you found this
No.
correspondence, I assume.
Well, what I found was he gave a speech to the National Safety Council, which were hugely impressed by this jaywalking ordinance. And
Mhm.
the National Safety Council is mostly insurance companies who don't like to pay out for people getting injured and killed. And so it helps if you can put the blame on the pedestrian for that. So he said, and he gave the speech to them, and the speech appeared in the National Safety Council's House organ. And he said, we have found that psychology is more effective than engineering. Now, I'm seeing this and I'm thinking, people around me think this is a new discovery, that behavior can trump engineering, and you really need to pay attention to behavior first. This guy, E.B. Lefferts, recognized that back in 1925.
That's great. Yeah, now of course we use it in a completely different way, which is like Vision Zero, and let's have roads that enforce the speed by their design rather than with signage, right? But he was talking about
Right.
it in a different way, obviously, in a much
Well,
darker way.
there's still also, of course, a behavioral angle that's different from Vision Zero that says things like, we have to um, educate pedestrians to that it's a shared responsibility and so on.
Right.
Now, we don't talk about ridicule being part of that education, although you do see the ridicule sometimes, even today, in some of the publicity or some of the publications around um, pedestrian safety. You will see even today that some of that is intended to make the pedestrian look stupid for taking chances.
Right. And I have to ask you, I'll ask you a last question because I have to go pretty soon. So we talked about the whole history of this, which is,
Hmm.
of course, very fascinating. Going forward, do you think there's any way we can work our way back and undo some of this? I mean, you talked about the sort of law, common law, statutory stuff. There's the cultural aspects. There's the ordinance, all these different ordinances. Do you see any sort of way of going back, or are we sort of stuck here, or are there new things that we should do?
Yes, I do see a way of going back. And so the main re motive I had in sending out that blast on LinkedIn saying, hope a reporter will cover this or other content creators will cover this.
Mhm.
My goal was I think we need to understand this history to get it right. And here's why. If you just listen to the conversation about these subjects, you hear all different points of view, but to my ears, the one I hear the most by far is, well, this is America. It's a car culture. People prefer to drive. The status quo we have today is because of popular preferences. It's because people wanted to drive. And that's why we have the status quo we have. And what I find is that the real history is a lot more interesting and surprising than that. But it also teaches us that the people who wanted America to be car dependent did not think that the popular preferences would ever be consistent with that ambition. They were the ones who were afraid of the public. They're the ones who wanted to overturn demands for speed governors, which were the real popular demand. They're the ones who wanted to shift the popular blame, which was directed at the driver and the car, onto the pedestrian. And so if we recover this forgotten history, we can recognize that America was always a walking culture, and
Mhm.
we can be a walking culture again, and history is on our side.
Yeah, you've armed me with many more new arguments to use against NIMBYs, as well as some great facts to share with fellow enthusiasts. Because, yeah, like I said, a lot of this I never heard of this ordinance before. So, Professor Peter Norton, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for sharing all this knowledge.